We need to make sure that our domain controller is powered on and our Windows 10 VM is powered on. They both have to be powered on at the same time and they have to be connected to the same network. So if you didn't use my NAT network setup that I'm using, just make sure that whatever you're using, it's the same. So right here I can see that my Windows 10 VM is on a NAT, and if I click over here on the domain controller, this domain controller is connected to a NAT network. So we need to match that. Right click on the Windows 10 VM and choose settings. And I'm going to go down to network, and under the attached to, I'm going to change it to NAT network, and we're going to select my NAT network. I'll click OK. And now we can just verify that they're on the same network. So if I just look at this, I can see NAT network and it's my NAT network. I click on the Windows 10 VM, NAT network, and it's selected to my NAT network. So now what we need to do is pop over to our Windows 10 VM and go ahead and reboot the VM. Anytime you make a hardware or settings change on a VM in VirtualBox, you want to go ahead and restart the VM to let the changes take effect. So we'll wait for the VM to boot back up, and then we'll rename the computer and join it to the domain. Okay, so the computer has come back online, so I'm going to hit right control and delete. And I'm going to type in my password here. And it's not wanting to resize the resolution like it should, so I'm just going to minimize it and drag it like this. And a lot of times that allows it to resize the resolution. There we go. We can see the dynamic resolution is now working. So I'm going to hit right control and F and go into full screen mode. And now I'm going to hit the start button in the bottom left hand corner, and I'm going to type in CMD. The first thing we need to do is open command prompt and make sure that we're on the same network as our domain controller. And we can see we're getting a 169 auto configuration IP. And what that means is that we're not reaching the DHCP server. Now, I'm not sure if that's because we just booted up the machine. It should be grabbing an IP address from the NAT network DHCP. But what we're going to do is, let me just run this again. Okay, so now that I run ipconfig again, it just took a moment. Now we have a 10.0.2.7 IP address, but that's not on the same network as our domain controller, which is on 192.168.0.1. This is a problem with VirtualBox. VirtualBox, the DHCP server, does not recognize what the default gateway is or what the network ID is. The NAT network only assigns IP addresses in the 10 subnet, regardless of what your network actually is. So what we're going to have to do is change this IP version 4 manually. Okay. Now, if we had the DHCP server role installed on our Windows Server domain controller, we wouldn't have this issue. We'd be able to turn off the DHCP server on our NAT network and use the Windows Server as a DHCP server. But we haven't done that yet, so we're going to have to settle for setting a static IP address. So in the bottom left corner, click the Start button, and we're going to click the Settings over here. And we're going to go to Network and Internet. Now we're going to click on Change Adapter Options here at the bottom. And we'll right click on Ethernet and choose Properties. And I'm going to uncheck IP version 6 since we're not using that. I'm going to select Internet Protocol version 4 and choose Properties. And I'm going to specify an IP address. So I'm going to select Use the following IP address. Okay, and we're just going to give it 192.168.0 since that's what my NAT network is configured to. And I'm just going to assign it to .100. We could use anything except for .0 as the last subnet. We couldn't use .0 because that's our network ID. And we couldn't use 10 because our domain controller is using 10. And we can't use 255 because that's the broadcast IP. So we could use anything in between 1 and 254, excluding 10 because 10's in use. So what I'm just going to use is .100. If I press Tab, it will auto-complete the subnet mask. Now, this is mathematically calculated based on the IP address that you're using. That's a whole different course, understanding the subnet mask and how IP works in subnetting. I'm not going to get into that right now. Just know that if you enter the IP address here at the top, you press Tab, it'll auto-complete it for you. You don't have to worry about it. All right, so for the default gateway, we're going to do 192.168.0.1. Now, 9 times out of 10, if we go back to our command prompt here, we can see that the default gateway that was assigned by DHCP is .1. Generally, that is your router's IP address. So if you have a switch that your computer's connected to, you would input that IP address here. It's not always .1. It could be .10 or .20 or .50. It could be anything, but it's generally the IP of your networking switch that you're connected to. Now, for the preferred DNS server, I get a lot of questions on this. Like, where do you find this IP address? How do you know what it is? It's the IP address of your DNS server that is on your network. In our case, if you remember, our domain controller has the DNS server role, so it's the IP address of our domain controller, which, if you remember, is .10. So 192.168.0.10. If we don't configure the DNS server correctly, we will not be able to join the domain, because the DNS server is what resolves itflea.com, which is the domain that we're going to try and join. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to hit close, and I'll close out of this, and we're going to run ipconfig one more time. And we can see here that we are getting an IP version 4 address of 192.168.0.100. Okay, so now we're on the same network. We could try and ping the domain controller, but the Windows firewall is going to block that on the domain controller. By default, you used to be able to ping and it would allow ICMP requests to go through, but now Microsoft blocks ping requests. So if I try to ping 192.168.0.10, I'm going to get a reply here because I have enabled it, but more than likely you will get a timeout back. So basically what you're going to see, if I just try and ping an IP address that's not valid, you're going to see something like this, where it's just going to say trying to ping, and then it'll say destination host unreachable, or it'll just say that there was a timeout, request timed out, just like that. Okay, so now that we're on the same network, what we're going to do now is try to rename the computer, and then we're going to join it to the domain. So again, under settings here, I'm just going to close out of this in case you closed yours. We're going to hit the start button, and we're going to click settings on the left side, and we're going to choose system. Then we're going to go down to about here at the bottom, and we're going to choose rename this PC. And right now it's set to this desktop dash, and I think that's like a serial number. It's randomly generated. What we're going to type in is ITF for itflea, and then WS for workstation, and I'm just going to call it 01. So itflea workstation 01. And we'll click next. And it's going to say you need to restart your computer. I'm going to say restart later. Next, we're going to go to connect to work or school. And down here at the bottom, we're going to say connect. And again, at the bottom, there's an alternate actions, and we're going to say join this device to a local Active Directory domain, because that's what we have set up. It's local on this network, and we're going to join it to a domain. So the domain is called itflea.com, and I'm going to click next. And this, since we got this pop-up saying enter your account to verify you have permissions to connect to the domain, this means that we are connected to the server. If we were not connected to the domain controller, we would not get this message. It would say it was unable to find it or unable to resolve it. Also, under the IP version 4 settings, if we did not specify the correct DNS server, it would not be able to resolve itflea.com. So I'm going to type in administrator, and I'm going to type in the password for that account. And this account, if you remember, is the account that we created when we installed Windows Server 2016. So it's our domain administrator account. Okay. Now I'm going to click OK. And now it's asking us if we want to add an account for the person who's going to be using this PC. Now I'm just going to hit skip. Don't need to do that. And now I'm going to choose restart now. Okay, so now the computer is going to restart. So once the computer reboots, we're going to pop out of this computer and go over to our domain controller. So we'll just give it a second to fully load. Okay, so now the VM has powered back on. This is the Windows 10 workstation. I'm going to hit Control and F, pop out of full screen mode, and now I'm going to minimize this Windows 10 VM, and I'm going to pop open my Windows Server 2016 VM. Okay, so I'll bring this over here. Again, I'm going to hit right Control and F, and I am in the domain controller now. So I'm going to hit right Control and delete, and I will log into the domain administrator account. This is the same account we just used to join the computer to the domain. If I select Tools, Active Directory, Users, and Computers, and if I expand itflea.com and click on Computers, which if you remember is the default container where computer accounts are placed, we can see that we have ITFWS01. So now we could drag it into another organizational unit if we'd like. We can assign GPOs to this computer. We'll get more into that later on in the course. But for now, that is how you join a workstation to a Windows domain. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.